Hey guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. One of the questions that I'm frequently asked is how can I prepare for the AP Lang exam outside of class? And one of the things that I recommend students do is to go through the College Board website and look at the different release prompts from previous exams. So if you do this, you'll start to notice certain trends in the way that the College Board words the prompts and the questions themselves. And so in this video, we're going to categorize those prompts into different groups. That way we can look at some similar phrasing and decide which prompts are best to study. Now, keep in mind that best is a relative term here. It's a matter of opinion, but I do think it is helpful to know how the College Board has phrased things on previous exams. That way you can make sure that if they use that phrasing again, you'll be well prepared to write that essay. While you might not have actually thought of the question asked in the prompt, a lot of the prompts deal with topics that students are readily familiar with. Things like school, libraries, the post office. However, some of the prompts like locavores or eminent domain might be a little bit more challenging because you don't necessarily have enough background info. Luckily, all that information can be found in the prompt itself or in the sources. However, if you are deciding to choose a prompt outside of class to practice with, I would recommend starting with something that you're readily familiar with, or at least that you have some familiarity with. That way you can feel a little bit more confident as you write that essay. As you get more comfortable, then I would start to look for prompts that you would consider a little bit more challenging, perhaps a prompt where you're not immediately sure which stance you would take. The first category that I've come up with is called factors prompts. Now, these are actually, in my opinion, the most common because it's the prompts where they say something to the effect of which factors should a group or agency consider, or which key issues should a person consider. And so in order to answer a prompt like this successfully, you need to assert a general claim. You need to decide which considerations deserve the most attention. If you're looking for a more approachable factors prompt, I would recommend the museum prompt from 2007 Form B. If you're looking to challenge yourself a little bit more, then I would recommend perhaps the locavore prompt or even the wind farm prompt, because a lot of students don't actually have a whole lot of background knowledge about either of those topics. Given the new rubric's emphasis on a defensible thesis, I've actually addressed this topic in previous videos, so I will link those in the iCards above and also in the description box below. But one thing to remember is that students need to clearly assert which factors need to be considered. So think of it this way: what and why. What do we need to consider? Why do we need to consider it? Given the frequency with which the College Board seems to use these factors prompts as far as a synthesis question on the exam, I think it's important for students to know certain factors or considerations that might apply to multiple prompts. So here is a list of different things that a student could write about. Not all of these considerations will apply to every single factors prompt out there. However, it's a good place to start. So if students can have a general idea of which factors they might consider, then they can approach the sources in a more targeted way. Given that the prompts use plural words like factors, issues, and considerations, it's important that students realize they need to choose at least 2 factors. Now, I personally would recommend that students choose 3 or even 4 factors to consider, because a lot of times as students write, they realize that some of their factors might be very similar and they can combine them in the same paragraph. Things like perhaps audience and public interest. So when students choose factors that are too similar, sometimes they're pulling from the same evidence or they're making a very redundant argument. So while 4 might seem like too much depending on your writing style, I think 3 is a strong average. You don't want to have too little to say and have it be redundant, but you also don't want to take on too much that you can't have a cohesive argument. But it's important to realize that you need separate factors. You need more than one thing for your essay as far as what should be considered. When thinking about your factors, you can actually create a hierarchy of sorts. So you could say that certain factors are more important to consider than others. And you could actually use this technique to set up a counterargument thesis, and you can even do a counterclaim and rebuttal in the body of your essay. I've actually spoken about this in previous videos, so I will link those videos in the iCards above and the description box below in case you're curious about how to do this. Another common phrase that students need to be familiar with besides factors or considerations is to simply assert a position. So basically, students need to realize that the synthesis essay is an argument with sources. So you need to take a concrete stance in your essay. Given that a synthesis essay is an argumentative essay at heart, all prompts require students to assert a position. However, if you're looking for specific prompts that use this phrasing, I have found that the three I've listed here tend to be quite popular with students. Well, as popular as essay writing can be. So the first one is the school curriculum prompt, in which students have to assert a position on whether or not a national English curriculum is warranted. This one allows for students to use their own experience as part of the commentary, perhaps. There's also the monolingualism prompt, which is a good one to ask because I think students sometimes tend to misunderstand this prompt, because the prompt is actually asking whether or not monolingual English speakers are at a disadvantage. It's not asking whether or not a person who speaks multiple languages faces an advantage. And sometimes students tend to flip this when they're writing the essay. So this is a good opportunity to learn that we must address the prompt at hand. And the third one that I really like is the public libraries prompt, simply because I think oftentimes students think of libraries as just a place where you can get a book. They don't necessarily realize that a public library has a larger role in the community. So this particular prompt can be enlightening and it can be very approachable. Some synthesis prompts use the word evaluate, so it's important that students recognize that they need to consider a variety of perspectives and evaluate those perspectives before asserting a position. So two prompts with this term in it that I think are very approachable to students are the daylight savings prompt and also the value of college prompt. Both of these are topics that most American students at least are familiar with and could write a strong essay about. With the evaluate prompts, I find that students sometimes use words like always or never, and these words actually weaken a student's argument. So it's very important that you not only have a clear claim, but that you don't reduce your credibility as a writer simply because of your word choice. So please avoid words like always or never when crafting a defensible thesis. Another thing to be mindful of is that some prompts actually include the word and. The College Board actually usually italicizes this, that way students can hopefully recognize that there are two different parts of the question that they need to address in their essays. So two examples of this would be the monuments prompt and also the wind farms prompt. Now, I don't necessarily think that students need to write both of these essays, but I do think it's valuable to look at the prompt itself and figure out how one might address both aspects of it. Because if it says and a student only addresses one side of it, it's very unlikely that he or she will score well. We also see this kind of phrasing in a couple of the question 3 prompts. The one that comes to mind first is the creativity prompt, where it asks students to essentially write to their school board about whether or not there should be a class on creativity. And so the and there was that they had to define creativity and propose whether or not there should or should not be a class. So it's really important that students take the time to notice these nuances of the prompt. So if it's italicized, I would definitely take a second to really focus on what the prompt is actually asking. It doesn't mean that you need to address the different parts of it evenly in the essay per se, but both aspects have to be there in order for you to be eligible for a higher score. The expression challenge, qualify, or defend is seen most frequently on question 3 of the exam. However, since a synthesis essay is actually just an argumentative essay with sources, it stands to reason that this phrasing could also be used on question 1 as well. So for this reason, I think the eminent domain prompt is definitely one that teachers and students should look at, because eminent domain is a topic that most students might not be readily familiar with. So not only do you get to grapple with a more complex issue, but also you get to practice challenging, qualifying, or defending a claim. I'm going to preface this with the note that some teachers have different definitions of what it truly means to qualify an argument. So in my classroom, if students qualify something, it means that they are noting a time when that particular argument would work and when it wouldn't. So this happens a lot in question 3, but it can also work in a synthesis essay. So even though a prompt doesn't say to qualify, there are certain ways that students can do it to show a little bit more sophistication in their argument. One prompt that comes to mind is the post office prompt. So this was a prompt that basically asked if the U.S. Postal Service needed to be restructured, and if so, how. Now, to me, if they say if so, how, that probably means that it does need some kind of restructuring. So this would perhaps mean that students could say that these elements of the Postal Service need to be restructured, and here's how, whereas these elements do not need to be restructured because they're working effectively. So in that instance, it's a bit of a qualified response because we're not suggesting a complete overhaul, nor are we we suggesting that everything remain the same? Another prompt where my students have tended to qualify in the past is when we've talked about the national curriculum prompt. Now, I have had some students assert a position of, yes, we absolutely need a national curriculum, and here's why, whereas other students have said, no, we definitely don't need a national curriculum, and here's why. Both of those responses are perfectly valid as long as you create a defensible thesis and prove your point. However, some students felt like there was this middle ground that needed to be addressed. And so some students argued that while we might need a national curriculum, it does not need to be as exact as some of the sources might have specified. It should still allow teachers choice. However, there does need to be some uniformity. So in this case, while the prompt didn't say the word qualify, students recognized that there were some nuances to the argument. And so all three of those responses, if argued well, would be legitimate. So I think it's important for students to realize that if they can find that middle ground and argue it well, that's fine. However, if a student struggles with that, I would recommend just asserting a very clear position, taking either, shall we say, the yes or the no side. Thank you guys so much for watching. I truly believe that exposure to previously used prompts helps students grow in their understanding of the College Board's expectations, which is why I find it very valuable for students to know the different types of questions they could be asked and how these questions might be phrased. So for this reason, I'm going to be coming up with subsequent videos on this topic, one for question 2 and one for question 3. So if you don't want to miss those, make sure that you are subscribed to this channel. And until next time, guys, happy writing!